You can change leaders like you change seasons, but the underlying forces driving the economy do not shift just because one person steps into or out of office. People often imagine that when a new president arrives, they carry with them the power to reverse decades of economic trends with a few signatures and speeches. But economies are not like a simple machine you can switch off and on. They are vast, complex systems built on years of decisions, laws, investments, and structural changes that cannot be undone overnight. Even the most charismatic, determined leader is bound by the frameworks and power structures that already exist when they take office. This is where so much public frustration comes from: the belief that a single election should bring sudden change, only to find that the deep problems remain. Political campaigns encourage this belief because it's easier to promise instant results than to explain the slow, difficult process of shifting economic systems. The reality is that these systems are shaped by decades of policies, trade agreements, and corporate strategies that operate independently of any one administration's agenda. The global economy, for instance, is interconnected in ways that limit what even the most powerful nations can do on their own. Outsourcing decisions made in the 1980s and 1990s still shape where factories are today. Tax laws rewritten to favor the wealthy in the early 2000s continue to impact how income is distributed. Deregulation that began years ago still influences the behavior of industries no matter who holds office. Leaders inherit an economy that has been molded by countless actors: lawmakers, corporations, international bodies, investors, and they cannot simply override all those forces with a stroke of the pen. This isn't to say leadership is powerless, but it operates within limits. The system has inertia. It resists quick changes, especially changes that threaten the interests of those who benefit most from the status quo. This is why we can have different presidents with opposing political brands and still see the same patterns: rising inequality, stagnant wages, job insecurity, and growing debt. These are not accidents that can be corrected with one bold move. They are the result of structures that have been in place for a long time. To address them would require confronting those structures directly, challenging the rules, and shifting how the economy distributes resources and opportunities. That is a much bigger task than any campaign slogan acknowledges. It is not about swapping one personality for another, but about recognizing that the real power lies in the system itself: the way industries are organized, the way wealth is accumulated, and the way political influence is bought and maintained. Until that is understood, leaders will keep coming and going, and yet the core problems will persist because the machinery they step into is still the same one that has been running for decades, moving under its own momentum, shaped not by the will of one leader, but by the accumulation of many forces over time. The steady erosion of manufacturing jobs in this country did not happen by chance, nor was it simply the result of technological progress. It was the product of deliberate policies and corporate strategies pursued over decades with clear goals in mind. Beginning in the late 20th century, business leaders and policymakers embraced the idea that production should move to wherever labor was cheapest. This meant closing factories in towns across the United States and relocating them to countries where wages were a fraction of what American workers earned. These decisions were justified as necessary for competitiveness in a globalized economy, but in practice they served to weaken domestic labor power and increase corporate profits. At the same time, there was an organized effort to undermine unions, which had long been a key force in securing fair wages, benefits, and working conditions. Anti union legislation, aggressive corporate resistance to organizing efforts, and a public narrative portraying unions as outdated all contributed to this decline. Without strong unions, workers had less bargaining power, and the terms of employment shifted dramatically in favor of employers. Secure, stable jobs with benefits gave way to temporary contracts, part time work, and positions that could vanish at a moment's notice. This transformation reshaped not only the labor market, but entire communities. Towns that had once thrived on manufacturing saw their tax bases shrink, their local businesses close, and their populations decline as young people left in search of work elsewhere. The loss of these jobs also had a ripple effect on other sectors, from suppliers and logistics companies to local shops and restaurants that depended on manufacturing wages circulating in the community. Politicians from both major parties promised retraining programs and a new economy that would replace the old one, but the reality fell far short of the rhetoric. Many displaced workers found themselves in service sector jobs that paid less, offered fewer benefits, and provided little stability. The narrative that workers simply needed to adapt masked the fact that the economy being built around them offered fewer opportunities for upward mobility. Corporate leaders and investors benefited from the shift because moving production abroad reduced costs and boosted profit margins. Consumers were told they would benefit too through cheaper goods, but the savings at the checkout counter did not compensate for the loss of stable, well paying jobs. Moreover, the political influence of large corporations grew, making it harder to reverse these trends. Trade agreements were written to protect corporate interests, not to safeguard domestic jobs. Regulations that might have encouraged companies to keep production at home were dismantled. Over time, this new economic reality became normalized. Entire generations grew up without the expectation that a manufacturing job could provide a middle class life. The deliberate dismantling of the manufacturing base was not presented to the public as a choice with winners and losers, but that is exactly what it was: a redistribution of economic security from workers to corporate balance sheets, executed step by step through policy, corporate planning, and global economic integration. The vast gap between the wealthy and everyone else is not an accident of fate or the unavoidable result of market forces. It is the product of deliberate policy choices and structural changes in the economy that have systematically favored those who own capital over those who work for wages. Over the past several decades, tax laws have been rewritten to reduce rates on the highest incomes, slash corporate taxes, and eliminate or weaken estate taxes, allowing enormous fortunes to be passed down from one generation to the next without significant redistribution. At the same time, loopholes and offshore tax havens have been expanded or left untouched, giving the wealthiest individuals and corporations the means to avoid paying even the reduced rates that remain. This shift in taxation has been accompanied by a financialization of the economy, where profits increasingly come not from producing goods and services, but from manipulating investments, stocks, and other financial instruments. Those who already have substantial wealth can leverage it to generate more wealth at rates that ordinary wage earners can never match. Meanwhile, the wages of most workers have stagnated when adjusted for inflation, even as productivity has risen. The extra value created by this increased productivity has not been shared with employees, but has instead flowed to executives, shareholders, and owners. Corporate governance structures have reinforced this dynamic by tying executive pay to stock prices, incentivizing short-term profit boosts over long-term stability or fair compensation for workers. Labor protections have been weakened, unions have been undermined, and the minimum wage has failed to keep pace with the cost of living, further tilting the balance of economic power toward employers. The result is a system in which the wealthiest 1% hold more wealth than the bottom 90% combined, and the income gap between them continues to widen. This concentration of wealth also translates into political influence, as the wealthy are able to fund campaigns, lobby for favorable legislation, and shape public policy to protect and expand their advantages. Media ownership, often concentrated in the hands of a few powerful corporations, influences the narratives the public hears about economic issues, often downplaying systemic causes and framing inequality as a matter of personal failure or success. The effects of this inequality are not limited to economic measures, they affect social mobility, political stability, and even public health. Communities with lower incomes face poorer schools, fewer job opportunities, higher crime rates, and worse health outcomes. The wealthy, insulated from these struggles, live in a different reality with access to resources and opportunities that most people cannot imagine. This structural imbalance perpetuates itself as wealth begets more wealth and the political system becomes less responsive to the needs of the majority. The rules have been written and rewritten in ways that ensure the flow of resources continues upward, and without a fundamental change in those rules, the gap will not close but will continue to expand, cementing a two-tier society where opportunity is increasingly determined at birth. The reliance on debt at every level of the economy is not a temporary condition, but a structural feature that has been developing over decades. For most households, wages have not kept pace with the cost of living, which means that paying for basic needs like housing, healthcare, and education increasingly requires borrowing. Families turn to credit cards, personal loans, and mortgages not as tools for luxury spending, but as lifelines to cover essentials. This dependency grows deeper when unexpected expenses arise, pushing people further into debt cycles that are difficult to escape. For many, the choice is not between debt and financial security, but between debt and immediate hardship. Corporations have also become deeply dependent on borrowing, but for entirely different reasons. Instead of using loans primarily for investment in new factories, equipment, or innovation, many large companies borrow heavily to buy back their own stock, a tactic that boosts share prices and rewards executives whose pay is tied to stock performance. This financial engineering inflates corporate valuations without necessarily creating new jobs or products. The corporate debt market has expanded enormously, making businesses more vulnerable to interest rate changes and economic downturns, yet the pressure to maintain high stock prices keeps the borrowing cycle alive. On the national level, governments rely on debt to cover budget deficits, often justified as necessary to fund programs and stimulate economic activity. In reality, persistent deficits also reflect a reluctance to raise taxes on the wealthy or to curb spending that benefits politically powerful interests. The cost of servicing this debt, paying interest, becomes a growing part of the budget, limiting flexibility for addressing urgent social needs. This pattern of borrowing is sustained because it has become normalized. Debt is no longer seen as a temporary measure, but as the default method of financing across the economy. Financial institutions profit enormously from this arrangement through interest payments and fees, giving them a vested interest in keeping households, corporations, and governments in a state of dependency. The link between stagnant wages and rising debt is especially critical. When people's incomes do not rise in real terms, borrowing becomes the only way to maintain a standard of living or to achieve milestones like buying a home or sending children to college. This creates a long-term drag on the economy as more income is diverted to debt repayment instead of being spent on goods and services that could stimulate broader economic growth. Moreover, high levels of debt make the entire system more fragile. An economic shock, such as a recession or a sudden spike in interest rates, can trigger a chain reaction of defaults, layoffs, and cutbacks that deepen the downturn. Despite the risks, the incentives in the current system encourage more borrowing, not less. For political leaders, promoting easy credit can be more palatable than addressing the underlying issue of income inequality because it creates the illusion of prosperity without requiring structural changes to how wealth is distributed. The fixation on political personalities as the central drivers of economic outcomes has created a distorted public understanding of how change actually happens. Elections are framed as decisive turning points with candidates presented as either saviors or threats, yet the structural forces shaping people's lives often remain untouched regardless of who holds office. This focus on individuals is convenient for the political system because it channels public frustration into campaigns and sound bites rather than into sustained pressure for systemic reforms. It also serves the interests of those who benefit from the current arrangements, as it keeps attention away from the deeper mechanisms that determine the distribution of wealth and power. By centering the narrative on leaders, media coverage and political discourse reduce complex issues to matters of personality, character, and leadership style. Debates become about whether a president is strong or weak, honest or dishonest, competent or incompetent, rather than about whether the underlying economic structures are fair or sustainable. This approach encourages the belief that a single election can deliver dramatic reversals in the direction of the economy, a belief that consistently leads to disappointment when the promised transformations fail to materialize. Structural issues like wage stagnation, corporate consolidation, financial deregulation, and the erosion of labor rights do not originate from one administration and cannot be solved by another without confronting entrenched interests that operate across party lines. The power to set the rules of the economy often lies not with elected officials alone, but with corporate boards, financial institutions, and international agreements that continue to function regardless of political turnover. Even when leaders have the will to enact change, they face enormous resistance from these forces, which have the resources to lobby, litigate, and mobilize public opinion in defense of the status quo. The repeated cycle of electing a leader, expecting immediate results, and then expressing disillusionment when those results fail to appear reinforces public cynicism and disengagement. This cynicism, in turn, further benefits those in power because a disengaged public is less likely to organize around substantive reforms. Focusing narrowly on political personalities also obscures the fact that many of the most significant economic shifts occur incrementally and without much public debate. Regulatory rollbacks, tax code adjustments, and trade negotiations often proceed quietly, shaping the economy in profound ways while the public conversation is dominated by scandals, speeches, and electoral drama. The personality centered view of politics creates a kind of theater in which visible conflict masks underlying continuity. Different leaders may adopt different rhetoric, but the basic trajectory of the economic system toward greater concentration of wealth and power remains intact. Without a shift in focus from the individual to the institutional, from the election cycle to the ongoing processes of policymaking and economic management, the same frustrations will repeat. People will continue to debate the merits of one leader versus another while the fundamental rules governing the economy remain unchanged, ensuring that the structural imbalances persist across administrations and political eras. Challenging entrenched economic power is far more difficult than most political promises acknowledge because the system is designed to protect itself from exactly that kind of challenge. The rules governing trade, taxation, labor relations, and financial markets have been shaped over decades to benefit those who already control large amounts of wealth and resources. These rules are embedded not only in domestic laws, but also in international agreements, corporate contracts, and the institutional culture of the economy itself. Changing them requires more than a new president or a shift in congressional majorities. It demands sustained political will, broad public support, and the ability to withstand intense resistance from those whose power is at stake. Wealth concentration translates directly into political influence, which means that the actors most threatened by systemic reform have the resources to mount campaigns against it, whether through lobbying, media influence, or funding opposition candidates. They can frame reforms as dangerous, economically irresponsible, or unpatriotic, shaping public opinion in ways that make it harder to build the consensus needed for change. This is why even modest attempts at regulation or redistribution are often watered down, delayed, or reversed before they can have lasting impact. The legal system also plays a role in preserving the status quo. Court challenges to reforms can drag on for years, during which time the old rules remain in place, and judges appointed by previous administrations may be ideologically aligned with protecting corporate interests. In addition, the complexity of the modern economy provides cover for inaction. Powerful actors can argue that changing certain rules will disrupt markets, scare off investors, or cause unintended consequences, and without deep understanding of economic structures, the public may be persuaded to accept these warnings at face value. This defensive architecture is reinforced by the global nature of today's economy. Capital can move across borders quickly, and corporations can shift operations to jurisdictions with more favorable rules, creating a constant threat of capital flight whenever reform is proposed. This mobility gives multinational corporations leverage over governments, which are often pressured to maintain low taxes and minimal regulation in order to remain competitive. Even within a single country, powerful industries often have deep ties to local economies, providing jobs and tax revenue that make elected officials wary of antagonizing them. These dynamics mean that any serious effort to confront entrenched economic power requires not just legislation, but also the building of alternative institutions, public education campaigns, and grassroots movements capable of sustaining pressure over the long term. Without these, reforms are easily reversed when political winds shift. The history of labor rights, environmental protections, and civil rights shows that systemic change is possible, but it rarely happens quickly or without significant struggle. Those who benefit from the existing arrangement will deploy every tool at their disposal to prevent meaningful redistribution of wealth or power, and overcoming that resistance requires persistence on a scale that goes beyond electoral cycles or the influence of any single leader.